Okay, let's get right into this. Welcome back to part 2 of our explainer on Carrie Lockhart's Guide to Long-Term Recovery, Finding the Signal. Now, if you remember the first half, we really broke down this premise that addiction is fundamentally a disease of disconnection. We looked at how substances completely hijack the brain and how those crucial early steps of recovery start to reestablish that lost signal. If you haven't seen that first part yet, you definitely should check it out, because today we are shifting gears. We are focusing entirely on how we transition from just finding that signal to rigorously, stubbornly keeping it. We're playing the long game today.
Because here's the thing, right? Getting the signal back is an incredible, hard-won achievement, but how do you actually keep it? This is exactly where so much recovery literature just kind of stops. But as the book points out, the rebuild is a very real, very slow process. The stress of daily life doesn't just magically vanish because you stopped using. Actually, sometimes the stressors stack up even higher. So today we're not rehashing the early stages. We are diving straight into the practical, daily blueprint, the literal toolkit you need to maintain your brain's newly established connection for the long haul.
So, here's our roadmap for today. First, the environment and community. Second, naming the adversary. Third, neuroplasticity and the mind. Fourth, the 4th step guide. And finally, daily practice and serenity. Let's dive in.
Section 1. The environment and community, people, places, and things.
You know, you have probably heard that old recovery cliche 1,000 times by now. You've got to change your people, places, and things. It gets repeated so often, it kind of just stops landing, doesn't it? But the book argues that this isn't just folksy advice. It's deeply rooted in hard science and some wildly fascinating theory. Your environment actively shapes your brain. The author carefully splits this into 2 distinct tracks. Over on the neuroscience layer, we have Dr. Nora Volkow's imaging research at the National Institute on Drug Abuse. She proved that the brain creates these intensely powerful associations, conditioned cue responses between the act of using and the sensory environment around you. So wandering back into an old environment isn't just a bad philosophical move. It is a direct, measurable neurological trigger firing off in your brain, even if the substance is nowhere to be found. Then, we have what the book calls the quantum layer. Lockhart points to the Global Consciousness Project at Princeton, which explores this idea that human emotions can actually create measurable deviations in physical reality. Now, to be totally clear, the book is very upfront that this is a speculative minority position in the scientific community. We're just impartially laying out the book's alternative framework here, the idea that we are literally impacted by the collective quantum field of the people around us. But honestly, whether you lean on the settled, hard neuroscience of cue response or the speculative physics of field resonance, the takeaway is exactly the same. Staying in a chaotic, disconnected environment means your recovery is constantly fighting a grueling uphill battle.
And this is exactly why willpower alone is the wrong tool for the job. Dr. Johann Hari hit the nail on the head when he said the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. Think about it. If someone's core wound is deep, profound isolation, asking them to heal by isolating themselves in a quiet room to white-knuckle through cravings, that is a total recipe for failure. Just look at the data. A massive 2020 Cochrane review analyzed every major study on group support. What do they find? Group support significantly outperforms solo clinical therapy when it comes to continuous abstinence. If we view this through the book's quantum lens, getting aligned with a group actually multiplies field coherence. The support isn't just adding up, it's exponential. And what about the 12 steps? Well, the author frames them not as some rigid religious text, but as an intentional language bridge. It's a completely translatable framework for observation, vulnerability, and repair that works no matter what your personal worldview happens to be.
Okay, Section 2. Naming the adversary. What works against you? Have you ever had that feeling in recovery where something strategic is actively working against you? Right at the exact moment you start building momentum? This section completely validates that experience. It is not just bad luck. The book highlights how this adversary operates using highly predictable mechanisms. First, it attacks the mind, using absolute thoughts, telling you, I'm never going to get better, or everything is completely ruined. Then, it actively drives isolation. It whispers these incredibly rational-sounding excuses for why it's totally fine to skip your support group tonight, and its timing is impeccable. It strikes right when your spiritual work is gaining the most traction. To ground this concept, Lockhart brings in Dr. M. Scott Peck, a psychiatrist who argued that malevolent dynamics are very real. He also ties it to the medical nocebo effect. Now, the nocebo effect is uncontroversial, replicated science. It proves that simply having negative expectations produces measurable, negative physical outcomes in the body. The adversary leverages this by feeding you negative expectations to actively derail your newly forming connections. You have to learn to spot these fingerprints.
Moving on to Section 3, Neuroplasticity and the Mind, your most powerful instrument.
There is a really pervasive fixed mindset story out there that a brain altered by addiction is just permanently damaged. That story is completely false. The very same mind that built all those elaborate rationalizations while you were using, that is not your enemy anymore. It is absolutely the most powerful instrument you possess. Just look at these three massive pillars of neuroscience. First, Dr. Michael Merzenich's work on neuroplasticity definitively proves the brain is soft-wired. That damage to the prefrontal cortex, the part handling judgment and impulse control, it isn't permanent. Give it the right conditions and it physically reorganizes. The function comes back. Second, Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz documented that directed thought literally alters brain structure. When patients deliberately redirected their thoughts, it produced measurable physical changes in their brain circuits. Every conscious choice you make is renovating your brain in real time. And third, Dr. Sarah Laser over at Harvard showed that consistent meditation directly increases the thickness of the prefrontal cortex. Let that sink in. The exact region of the brain that addiction erodes is physically rebuilt by the spiritual practice of quieting the mind. It's amazing.
Section 4. The Fourth Step Guide. Detonating the False Structure.
Now this step is so frequently misunderstood. People dread it. But Appendix B of the book reframes it brilliantly. This isn't some shameful confession session or a moral punishment. Think of it more like an accountant's audit. The inventory process is broken down into three distinct areas: resentments, fears, and conduct. By taking these unresolved chaotic patterns out of what the book calls quantum superposition and observing them clearly on paper, you collapse them into a definite state, something you can actually look at and change. Clinical psychiatrist Dr. Daniel Siegel calls this process narrative integration. When you write these things down and transform highly charged, scattered memories into a single coherent story, it literally changes how your brain processes those experiences. The trauma just loses its grip because you're finally seeing it as a whole.
So let's slow down here for a second, because these exact questions are the tools you'll use to detonate those false structures. For every single resentment, you ask yourself, who or what are you resentful at? Next, what actually happened? And here, you have to keep it strictly factual, 1 to 3 sentences max, no spinning a whole dramatic saga. Third, what part of you is affected? Was it your sense of security, your pride, your trust? And finally, the hardest question of the whole bunch, what was my part? Now listen, finding your part is not about victim-blaming yourself for someone else's terrible actions. Not at all. It's simply about identifying the machinery of your own character defects, things like underlying fear, selfishness, or wounded pride that were operating just below the surface. Because once you see that same machinery running the exact same program across 50 different situations in your life, you suddenly have the power to dismantle it.
After resentments, the inventory shifts over to your fears and your past conduct. The author briefly touches on Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's groundbreaking trauma research from The Body Keeps the Score. And what we know for sure is that unexamined fear doesn't just politely stay in the past, it literally lives in your physical body. It drives your present behavior as a desperate, adaptive response to old threats. Bringing this fear, along with your past conduct, out into the light is exactly what strips it of its power. Shame tells you a lie, that you are simply the sum of your absolute worst behavior. But honest accounting? Honest accounting says, I am a person who acted out of deep fear and disconnection, and I am now choosing to see that clearly so I can begin making actual repairs.
And finally, Section 5, Daily Practice and Serenity, Maintaining the Signal Long Term.
Drift in recovery rarely happens with some massive, dramatic crisis. It's sneaky. It happens when your morning practice is quietly replaced by scrolling on your phone, and isolation, slowly, day by day, becomes more comfortable than community. To actively combat that drift, the book gives us this exact, incredibly practical structure in Appendix C. I really encourage you to try using this every single day. In the morning, give yourself just 5 minutes before you even glance at your phone. Engage in genuine prayer or conscious contact. Make one completely honest statement about where you are at that moment. Find one specific thing you're grateful for and set a clear intention for how you want to show up in the world today. Then midday brings the pause. When you feel that stress spike, stop, take a breath, name the stress out loud, and ask yourself, is this actually mine to act on right now? In the evening, review your day. What went well? Where did you fall short? Express another specific gratitude and then consciously release the things you shouldn't be carrying in to sleep. And weekly, consistent meeting attendance. Period. Think of this as non-negotiable field maintenance. Even on the days when the connection feels totally distant or fake, use this framework. Acting as though the connection is there is exactly the mechanism that brings the feeling back.
That midday pause is actually the perfect introduction to the absolute brilliance of the Serenity Prayer. The Serenity Prayer is, at its core, a highly efficient sorting mechanism for human stress. On the left side of the ledger, we have what is actually yours to control: your actions, your thoughts, your daily habits. On the right side, everything that is not yours: timelines, how quickly other people choose to forgive you, or ultimate legal and financial outcomes.
Psychologist Dr. Stephen Hayes' research on acceptance and commitment therapy perfectly validates this concept. When you continuously attempt to control uncontrollable outcomes, you perpetually activate your body's stress response, which physically impairs your higher brain function. But the moment you consciously release what you cannot control, it immediately lowers your cortisol levels. It restores function to your prefrontal cortex, freeing up all that cognitive horsepower so you can focus entirely on the next right action. Surrender isn't some weak passive thing. It is strategically, neurologically intelligent.
Which really brings us to the core takeaway of this entire explainer. Recovery is not a destination. You don't just cross a finish line and get a certificate. It is a daily, ongoing practice of connection, honesty, and surrender. Maintaining this signal doesn't mean your life is suddenly going to be perfect or magically free from hardship. What it means is that you are genuinely connected enough and present enough to survive whatever hardship comes your way without ever having to numb yourself to it again.
I want to wrap this up with a thought straight from the author. The signal is there, it has always been there, and you are not walking back to it alone. You now have the blueprint. You understand the neuroscience, you know the mechanics, and you have the daily habits. The signal is out there broadcasting right now. The only question left is, are you ready to tune in?